Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll get started in one more minute, just waiting for people to join in case they're stuck in Zoom traffic or finishing up some meetings. We'll give it another minute or so, and then we'll get started with this month's series of Inside the Acid-Free Box. Okay, perfect. Welcome to Holocaust Museum LA's program Inside the Acid-Free Box, where Christy, our Chief Curator of Collections, and myself, the Vice President of Education and Exhibits, take you in a behind-the-scenes look at some of our collection that does not make it onto the museum floor. This special program is going to be in conjunction with our recent exhibition, Hidden Histories, recounting the Shanghai Jewish story. And we'll be looking at some artifacts that were unfortunately not included in the exhibition, which features over 104 artifacts, as well as exploring 2 of the 5 survivor stories that we feature in the exhibit. So here you can see a great photograph of a map that is from one of the documents that is included in the exhibition, showing a map of China in Hebrew. And you can see Shanghai is listed, as well as Harbin, which are 2 cities that we mentioned in the exhibit and in this program. As you can tell, Christy is joining us from our locked archive, where visitors are not permitted, and you have to have very special requirements in order to be around our primary source collection, made up of paper and 3D objects and photographs and oral histories that are kept secure and collected in perpetuity. So thank you for joining us, Christy. For those of you who have not joined us before, just a little bit of information about our archival collection. We have 120 collections, over 10,000 artifacts and documents, probably hundreds of thousands of individual pieces of paper. Many of our collections relate to a particular person or family, and include materials, as I mentioned, that are secured in the archive, such as photographs, documents, 3D objects, badges, pins, textiles, family heirlooms, and testimony. Currently on exhibit is Hidden History, recounting the Shanghai Jewish story, which features 104 artifacts, including those from the Medavoy and Friedmann family collections, which are the 2 collections that we will be exploring today. As many of you know who visited Holocaust Museum LA, our mission is to commemorate, educate, and inspire, and to really engage visitors and students in critical thinking around primary source artifacts in our galleries. We use them on all of our tours and all of our programs, and really invite people to think about the social relevancy of the Holocaust through these primary sources. And here is a photograph of some people exploring the 104 artifacts that are featured in the Hidden History collection, and really learning from the personal stories of the people who were directly impacted during the Holocaust and found themselves in Shanghai. So a little bit of background information. We are talking about Jewish life in China. Shanghai, of course, is in China. So from the 2nd century BCE, which if we all remember our history from high school or even middle school, learning about the Silk Road, this major conduit across Europe, really before the time that ships and maritime trade were in use. This was the main way that people traded across the continents and countries. And really, for Jewish communities living along the Silk Road, they were in a unique position, because at this time, Hebrew was still a commonly spoken language among different Jewish communities. So Jewish merchants could easily travel across the Silk Road and interact with local communities in Hebrew, who could then translate into local languages. So even though we don't have evidence dating all the way back to the 2nd century at the height of the Silk Road, we can assume that there were Jewish merchants moving throughout China. In fact, the oldest single document that shows of Jewish people stepping foot in China is from the 9th century. And it's written in Judeo-Farsi, which is a dialect of Farsi spoken by Jews, talking about the buying and selling of sheep. So we have evidence that Jews have been in China as merchants since the 9th century. although really that first established community goes back about 1,000 years to Kaifeng. And here you can see a photograph on the upper left-hand corner of two Kaifeng Jews, and they are wearing skull caps known as yarmulkes or kippot. And in fact, the photograph next to them is a photograph in our collection, or is an artifact on exhibit right now in the exhibition, and it's on loan to us from the Skirball Museum. And it is this beautiful blue silk kippah, and this color blue is very rich and vivid, but also speaks a little bit to the fact of this first Jewish community that was established in Kaifeng. And in fact, there are many different ways that people in China refer to Jewish people. In fact, one of them translates into the sinew removing people, because Jewish people don't eat the sciatic nerve, which dates, or actually is a commandment in Genesis. This isn't a Torah study group, so I won't go into that. Or they were referred to as the blue-hatted people, or the blue-hatted Muslims, because Jews wore these blue kippot in Kaifeng. And here we have an example of one. So this is a really interesting artifact that we were so grateful to the Skirball Cultural Center to loan to us for this exhibit, because it really does speak to what we know as this reference that Jewish people were referred to as the blue-hatted people wearing these blue kippot. Now, moving us a little bit fast forward in history and speaking specifically about Shanghai. So in the 19th century, the Opium Wars between China and the British ended. And as part of the peace treaty, China agreed to make 5 cities international port cities, Shanghai being one of them. And so in 1883, the first Jewish person steps foot in a modern China, in a modern Shanghai, excuse me. And this is an Iraqi Jew originally from Baghdad via Bombay. And this is the Sassoon family. And so, the history of Iraqi Jews, we won't get too much into, but Iraqi Jews lived through centuries in Iraq. Really almost 3,000 years, Jewish people have been able to trace Iraq as their homeland, but of course faced, waves of violence and waves of peace throughout those 3,000 years. At the end of the 19th century, they were under Ottoman rule, and there had actually been quite a lot of anti-Semitism and violence during this time. And so a lot of Baghdadi Jews were looking for a place to go. And this newly freed port city of Shanghai happened to be one of them. So in 1883, that first person, Sassoon, brings himself to Shanghai and starts working out of there, bringing more and more Jews from the Ottoman Empire, specifically Baghdad, to Shanghai. Simultaneously, at the turn of the 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, saw the expansion of the Trans-Siberian Railroad with the Chinese Eastern Railway. And this opens up Harbin as well as Shanghai for Jews who are seeking work opportunities, as well as an escape from oppression and anti-Jewish violence in the Russian Empire. So the turn of the 20th century, you have Mizrahi Jews coming mostly from Iraq and Ashkenazi Jews coming from the Pale of Settlements and Russia. So that was a lot of talking. Christy, is there anything specific that you would like to add?
I don't know if you mentioned, but that's the images that we're looking on the screen right now. So the bottom right image is actually David Sassoon and his sons, which Jordana mentioned, the Baghdadi Jewish family that were kind of integral in, putting Shanghai on the map as like an international city. And then on the bottom right is actually the synagogue in Harbin, which was also a big Jewish community in China at that time.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention, if anyone has any questions, you can drop them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we will have time to answer them at the end of the presentation. So, following the Russian partition of Eastern Europe, so at the end of the 18th century, Poland is partitioned by its neighbors, meaning Prussia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Russia. And following the Russian partition, Jews under Catherine II, sometimes known as Catherine the Great, were confined to this area known as the Pale of Settlement, which you can see a map of here. So that we're talking parts of modern day Lithuania, Poland, Belarus, Ukraine. And they were excluded from being able to live anywhere else. And this compiled with unparalleled violent anti-Jewish pogroms erupting around 1881 and continuing to escalate over the course of the next 3 decades, really push Eastern European Jews into thinking, where else can we go? Is there a place we can go? So if any of you watching are like me and have roots of Jewish ancestry coming to New York at the turn of the 20th century, this is what they're fleeing. And for those who weren't able to go west to America, many of them went east on that Trans-Siberian Railway that I mentioned. And so this really allowed a lot of Jews to come from Eastern Europe and start settling in cities like Harbin, which we were just mentioning. And really by the time of the 1930s, there's a significant community of nearly 30,000 Jews living in Harbin and really calling this place home. So this is a crucial Jewish community in China at the time. So just thinking sometimes that, we're not always looking at the western part of the map, we're looking at the eastern part of the map. And for all of those Jews fleeing the pogroms and the extreme violence in Eastern Europe, those who couldn't go west went east. And even though there is a lot of immigration west, there is also a lot of immigration east as Jews are looking, or as Jewish refugees are simply looking for places to work and live in freedom and be free of anti-Semitic violence. So that takes us right up to our first family that we're going to cover, the Medavoy family. So first speaking about Dora Medavoy, I'm going to see if I can get my little pointer here. Okay, so here's Dora. So Dora is born in Harbin. As we mentioned, this growing, rich Jewish culture that's flourishing in Harbin from people who had fled the Pale of Settlement. So really looking again at Ashkenazi Jews, mostly from Russia, Ukraine, modern day Belarus, Poland. So Dora is born, she's the youngest of 15 children, and they're originally from Odessa, modern day Ukraine. And after the death of her father, Dora, her mother, and two of her siblings relocate to Shanghai. And then in 1939, Dora meets Mike Medavoy through Beitar, a youth Zionist movement that actually was born out of Lithuania and was a worldwide Zionist youth organization. So also had branches in China. And he had been born in Ukraine in 1918 and had also immigrated with his family to Shanghai. And in fact, his aunt had first moved to Shanghai and sent a letter back to the family in modern day Ukraine, then Russia, saying, I finally found a city where we can be safe. And that city was Shanghai. So the pair are married in 1940 at the Ohel Rachel Synagogue, and they settle among the Russian Jewish community that's living in the French concession. So now there's, thinking about Shanghai as this growing metropolis after it's made into this international city. There are thousands of Russian Jews living there, as well as a few hundred Baghdadi Jewish communities living there as well. And so there's already this support, these organizations that are established in the city. And this really brings us up to the point of the Holocaust and thinking about how the Jewish refugees fleeing the Nazis find the city when they arrive. But here in these photos, you can see just very simple, normal daily life that Jews experienced living in China, going to the beach, having New Year's parties, working. This is actually Dora worked in a corset store until she was able to open up her own store, walking down the streets. And then here's, of course, a photograph of them getting married, eating in what I believe to be a sukkah, but it's not been confirmed, but really just enjoying life, making friends, having parties, celebrating Jewish traditions, and really thinking about that this was everyday life. Just simply, it wasn't in Europe, it wasn't in the US, it was in China. So here's an artifact that we have on loan from the Medavoy family, this really beautiful leather-bound photo album. And you can see that the rich detail of the cover is of the city of Shanghai. And what I think is so incredible about photographs, and really what I want to highlight here, is when you look at photographs, you're thinking, of the people in the photographs. You're looking at people who look very similar to us, doing things that we do almost every single day, and showing that this was simply life for them. And this was simply the life that they had before the violence, war, and anti-Semitism uprooted them and forced them elsewhere. So a few more photographs we'll see in the albums, but again, just the everyday celebrations, whether it be a Shabbat dinner, a daring motorcycle ride with no helmets, or simply going swimming or hanging out with friends. This was the everyday life of the Medavoy family. And so I'll stop the share now because I know Christy has a bunch of artifacts to show us and to add to the story of the Medavoys in China.
Yeah, so like Jordana mentioned, the two families that we're featuring today are part of the Hidden History exhibit. So a lot of the collection is on display in the 8th gallery downstairs. So please come and visit if you'd like to see more of the artifacts. But we do have some of the materials up in the archive as well. So this is the photo album that Jordana just showed a moment ago, which actually has the cover of it is an imprint of the Bund in Shanghai, which was kind of like the waterfront, very famous area of Shanghai. I don't know if you can really see it in this, but it also has the family crest on the front right here, the Medavoy family crest. And so this had like a lot of individual photos that Jordana has shown some of those already. But this one in particular is a picture of both Michael and Dora, who you can see in the middle just here. This is Dora, this is Michael. But it's actually also with the two families. So this is Dora's mother, brother, and sister. And then this is Michael's family on this side. So yeah, you can actually see the two families, both who had immigrated to Shanghai, prior to the Holocaust period and really in the earlier 20th century. So we talked a little bit about Michael, but he, worked for the Shanghai telephone company. So this is a picture of him and some of his friends at that time. If you could see the handwritten inscription at the bottom, it actually says like the telephone company gang, which is very cool. So you can see him with some of his friends at this time. And then also, I think a similar photo to the one that Jordana had showed before, but this is Michael and Dora and a third person, just kind of everyday life that they were living in Shanghai at the time.
Yeah, and I mean, as a young couple, they enjoyed this cosmopolitan city, which we'll talk about in a second, and they went to parties and dances and socialized. And it's really just, interesting to think about the normalcy of the life and the fact that Dora, for example, was born in China. And as you mentioned, Michael worked as a mechanic and then became a manager at the Shanghai telephone company. And I believe you have some of his artifacts related to his time working there.
Yeah, so the family had actually loaned us, there's a couple of things actually. So this photo was taken a little bit later, but this is actually a photo of him with his colleagues. This is him in the middle here. And I don't know, I mean, we can definitely tell from this that he's a little bit older in this photo. So this one was actually taken a little bit later. But also Dora and Michael had two children, Mike and Veronica, or Ronnie, and they actually, I think Mike actually had the chance to go back to Shanghai later on in life because he was born there. And the Shanghai phone company that his father worked for actually had put together this incredible book of materials that they had in their archives that were related to his father. So, inside of this was his card, his like work card basically, which we have on display downstairs, and then a number of other like documents with relation to his work there. So like this is a letter with respect to his salary being adjusted, and there's other things about his particular, like confirming that he was employed, which we'll talk about it a little bit, was required to be able to immigrate after the war had ended, and just any materials that they had in their archive related to him, which I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah, and as we mentioned, the couple were married in a synagogue that's actually still standing today, the Ohel Rachel synagogue. And Christy, if I remember correctly, I think it was actually built by the Sassoons.
Correct. Yeah. So this is that photo that we had showed earlier, but just a larger version of it. So this is actually obviously Dora and Michael on this side.
Yeah, under the chuppah at their wedding at this synagogue that had been built by the Baghdadi Jews, but still was used by the Ashkenazi Jewish community, as evident from this Ashkenazi wedding taking place. And Christy, should we speak a little bit about the city of Shanghai and how it was laid out now, or should we save that for when we're talking about the refugees? Because we mentioned that in the 19th century, after the Opium Wars, the city became an international port city, and this just really allowed a lot of international trade to flourish in the city. So the city gets divided up into different districts because it's this international port city. It doesn't have as many local politics as other countries or cities would have. It's free, for example, of entry visa restrictions that other countries would have to enter it. It's really open for anyone who wants to come and trade. And so the city is managed by different groups. So we mentioned that the Medavoy settle in the French concession. So not necessarily that they're French. This is just the area of the city that was sort of managed by, if I understand correctly, like a French contingency.
Yes, I think it was part of what you were talking about with the treaty earlier, divided the city, made it an international port city, but also divided it as such that it was kind of separated into different settlements. So there was a settlement that was called the French concession that was essentially managed and policed by the French. And then there was the international settlement, which was the British and the American. There's a whole other history, which we won't go into around that part of it, but it was essentially separated. And then there was a third area that was really the Chinese district, but then would ultimately become occupied by the Japanese with, the Holocaust and World War II, which we'll go into in a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. And just understanding, so going now, we're sort of taking this international trip across the globe, going between all of these different continents, but now we're shifting a little bit back. So the 1930s, we mentioned, is this flourishing, amazing, life in Shanghai for the Jewish community, whether they be Mizrahi or Ashkenazi. They have synagogues, they have communities, they have youth organizations, they have schools, just like any other Jewish community globally. However, the 1930s for those living under the Nazis is extremely difficult and violent with increased anti-Semitism. So within weeks of coming to power, Hitler is appointed chancellor in January of 1933 in a democratically parliamentary styled election. But within weeks, he really begins dismantling democracy and paves the way for a totalitarian anti-Semitic government, which he leads. Within weeks of really coming to power, he's enacting anti-Jewish laws by that April that Jews are forbidden from practicing law, being doctors, being public servants. And I always say to students who come to the museum, think about everything you do during the weekend, whether it's walking your dog or doing your homework or helping your parents with grocery shopping or going to the park or going to the movies or riding public transportation. At a given point in time, Jews living under Nazis were unable to do any of those things. So really this process of dehumanization on the most basic level, Nazis making Jewish people feel so dehumanized that they would just not exist anymore. So they really begin segregating and isolating Jews from society. By the way, I'll just mention German Jews were a minority of the German population, less than 1% of the population. So Hitler really used them as a scapegoat to fearmonger and gain power for himself. Jews living under Nazi control desperately tried to emigrate. Nobody wants to live really under these horrific, extreme restrictions. But there was entrenched anti-Semitism actually here in the State Department in the US, and there was a strict quota system in most countries, and this restricted immigration. In addition to having a quota system in the US, America failed to fill that quota system the majority of the years from 1933 to 1939, simply because of anti-Semitism. There was even a conference held in Evian, France, where over 30 countries came together to talk about this refugee crisis of Jews just simply trying to escape Nazis. And only one country, the Dominican Republic, agreed to increase their quota. So really there was nowhere to go. And though seeming like an unlikely refuge, remember what we said, Shanghai did not require an entry visa. So although all of these countries are closing their doors, the simple fact that Shanghai had been set up as an international port city meant that Jews could go there if they left everything behind. And it really became the only option for Jews trying to escape the brutal violence. Here you can just see some images of Jews in Vienna being forced to scrub the streets, Jewish stores being broken into and looted, and the long lines of people just trying to find out if they are able to emigrate, if they are able to leave with their lives. In March of 1938, Nazi Germany annexes Austria, and all of those anti-Jewish laws are now in place for Austrian Jews as well. Vienna, a very cosmopolitan city, a city with a long history of having a Jewish community. About 9% of the city is Jewish, and all of these anti-Jewish laws within a few days come into play. And so again, that Jewish refugee crisis is really extreme. So this takes us to the second family that we're going to be talking about today, the Friedmann family. So John Friedmann was born in 1913 in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is now, this section is now Slovakia. He was an only child, and he and his mother moved to a small town in Upper Austria. In April of 1938, so remember, this is weeks. What did I just say? March of 1938 is the annexation of Austria. So the following month, the Gestapo knock on his door, arrest him, and deport him to Dachau concentration camp, which had been established in April of 1933, within months of Hitler coming to power, for the simple reason that he's a Jewish person, so identity-based violence. Then he's sent to the Buchenwald concentration camp. This is an incredible story. So of course his mother is trying to find out if she can get him released. What mother wouldn't? And she happens to have a friend who's a police officer who isn't Jewish, and they come up with this plan that the police officer writes to the commandant of the camps and says, oh, actually, we need this Jew, John, we need him because he had a crime and we need to charge him for this crime. And if he's in the concentration camp, we can't hold him accountable. So the concentration camp releases him. And this is really the pivotal moment for John understanding that he needs to find a place for him and his mother to escape from. So here you can actually see his ID card, and it's stamped with a J. This was a law from the Nazis to further isolate and segregate and identify Jewish people. Every single Jewish person needed to turn in their ID cards and make sure that they're stamped with the letter J, identifying them as Jewish. And Christy, will you tell us a little bit about these artifacts, which we can't show you the originals because they're in the exhibit right now, so you're going to have to come to the museum to see them. But tell us how these artifacts are part of this larger story.
Yeah, so these are actually the postcards that Jordana just mentioned. Incredibly, John, well, now Joyce, his daughter, have the postcard that his mother, John's mother, Rudolphina, sent to the camp saying, you know, my son has been arrested and deported. I'm trying to locate him. I didn't actually know this until I was going back and listening to his testimony again in preparation for this talk. But I guess she sent through, you would send the card that you had written your request on, but also a card to return. So it went with two cards, one that the person could answer. So, and then the other postcard that we have is actually the response from the commandant at the camp, saying, you know, that your son has been transferred elsewhere. So we have both of those postcards on display in the gallery as part of the Hidden History exhibit. And then this is just a short clip of John from his Shoah Foundation testimony, I think, which you can also probably access online, where he's really talking about this period after he is released that Jordana mentioned, and he, you know, the realization that they need to find a way to get out. You know, he you know, understood the danger essentially, and you know, was understood that he and his mother needed to find a place to go, and had kind of heard about Shanghai as this possibility.
Then afterwards, I went back again to my mother, to Vienna, and we tried to get to the travel agency and to get a ride. We went to the Jewish Community Service. The Jewish Community Service said, well, we can get you out of here if you want to go to Palestine. I say, oh, that's nice, I go to Palestine. I say, well, my mother is here. Oh, we cannot take your mother. We only can take people there to 25, 26 years old. You cannot take your mother. You cannot take your mother. So my mother would have to stay there. So I said, no, I'm not going to go. So they say, well, look in the hall, we have something about Shanghai. So that the letter said about Shanghai, it says, the people sleeping in Shanghai on the streets, the rats are running around there. It's a very dirty situation. I didn't know about it. It was my only way. I say, we go to see to Shanghai. We go travel agent, get a ticket to Shanghai.
And as you can see, John's explaining that there's simply no option for him and his mother except to go to Shanghai. And even to even have that opportunity to go to Shanghai, which had no entry visa, they still needed an exit visa from the Nazi government. And we actually have some documentation that in the exhibition that John has an official notice that he owes the Nazi government $0 in taxes. This is an example of all of the paperwork that needed to be done in order to even leave. Money needed to be left behind, businesses were left behind. anything worth of monetary value left behind. All people could do was simply flee with their lives. And luckily for John, he learned about Shanghai as an opportunity for him and his mother.
Yeah. And, you know, I think the one important thing and another incredible story that he talks about in his testimony as well is that, you know, in November of 1938, obviously with Kristallnacht, which I don't know if we really touched on. Jordana, maybe.
No, yeah. So, you know, I mentioned all of this sort of rising of anti-Jewish violence, really making, you know, it clear to Jews that they are not wanted in this country. But there's a pivotal moment in November of 1938 that just unleashes an orgy of violence and anti-Semitism and brutality. And that is the Kristallnacht pogrom, or the November pogrom as it's known, where across Nazi Germany, which includes Austria at this point, Jewish homes are broken into and ransacked. Synagogues are burned to the ground. Jewish businesses are destroyed and looted. And additionally, about 100 Jewish men are killed that night, and 30,000 Jewish men are arrested and sent to concentration camps like the ones John had been in. And this is the single largest arrestation of German and Austrian Jews in a single movement ever during the Holocaust. So it's incredibly large. And Christy, how John has just been miraculously released from a concentration camp. How does he escape the violence of Kristallnacht?
Right. So he goes to see his mother. His mother's in Vienna. So at this point, he goes to see her, and then, you know, I guess she understands, and he does also, that there is like something brewing, something is going to happen. You know, and the tension and the violence that was to come, I suppose. And so kind of in some ways foreseeing that, he decides to go back to Vöcklabruck, which is the town in Upper Austria that he had previously been living in. And on, you know, November 9th, he gets on a train and takes the train there. So unbeknownst to him, he incredibly is able to avoid you know, this huge arrestation of Jewish men, violence, and, you know, looting of Jewish businesses, and just really horrific pogrom that happens on that day/night and continuing into the next, and is able to avoid that miraculously by being on the train during that time.
Then after.
So we learned a little bit about what's going on in Nazi Germany and Nazi controlled areas in Europe, really understanding this bleak future for Jews who remain. And looking towards Shanghai, not only is it a port city where people don't need an entry visa, but there's already an established Jewish community in Shanghai. So at this point, Shanghai is actually quite an international city. The early 20th century, Shanghai was really catapulted onto the international stage. It became a hub of international commerce and tourism. It was called the Paris of the East. And in part, it was really built up by the Baghdadi Jews, who were these early merchants at the end of the 19th century, specifically the Sassoon family and the Kadoorie family. You know, there were skyscrapers that rivaled Chicago. There was a public transportation system. People could buy American shirts, Cuban cigars, Swiss watches, really this vacation spot, if we want to talk about it. So really, you know, the first skyscraper in the Eastern Hemisphere, for example, was the Cathay Hotel, built by Victor Sassoon, and tourism was booming. So in addition to it being this international city, there was this Jewish community of thousands of Russian Jews and hundreds of Baghdadi Jews, who were able to come together and create a support system for the Jews fleeing. So in addition to it being this hub of an international city, really thinking about the Jewish organizations that came together and immediately started helping the Jewish refugees who are coming with nothing. So we talked a lot about the Sassoons, but Sir Victor Sassoon opens up some of the buildings and his hotels as a welcoming center where Jewish refugees could come and have housing and have food and have clothing, which they were not coming with. He also sets up a fund to make small business loans so that Jewish refugees can set up businesses and get their feet on the ground. Then there are also from the Ashkenazi community, groups like Betar, which Dora and Michael Medavoy were a part of, and where they actually met, as you remember, helped receive refugees and transported vital supplies like food and medical attention. And so Michael Medavoy was also a member of the Shanghai Volunteer Corps, which was a group that volunteered to protect the Jewish refugees in the international settlement, while in tandem with the police force, but knowing that the refugees definitely needed protection and needed somebody to speak up for them and to protect their interests. And of course, they're able to actively protect the Jewish refugee community until they're disbanded by the occupying Japanese in 1942. So although arrival in Shanghai is definitely a culture shock for the Jews coming from Europe, the refugees start establishing normalcy because of this incredible multicultural, multi-ethnic Jewish network that exists in Shanghai. Businesses, stores, restaurants are opened, and an area of Shanghai is even known as Little Vienna. And here is a photograph of Shanghai at that time, this really incredible international city, that the Paris of the East. And I know that Christy has some artifacts to show us.
Yeah, so we just have some more pictures of, the waterfront area of Shanghai at that time, and the same photo, you can really see kind of like the skyline that Jordana was just showing, that was really developed by the Sassoons and the Kadoris, and like really putting the city on the map. And then the group Bata that Jordana had mentioned before, that Dora and Michael were both a part of. So this is actually a photo from like a Bata book, and you can see the little asterisks with the arrow. That's Michael Medavoy there, and this was actually taken in 1938, and was the group that Dora and Michael met and were ultimately married.
So one thing that did happen in the 1930s in Shanghai is that the Japanese occupied the Chinese district of the city. So the Japanese occupation of the city began in the 1930s, but it isn't until after Pearl Harbor that the Japanese occupied the entire city of Shanghai. And this has a really big impact for all of the Jews of the city, whether they be refugees or whether they be Jews who had already been established and living in Shanghai long before the Holocaust. So, on February 8th, 1943, the Japanese issued this proclamation establishing a designated area for stateless refugees. But in the year prior, between Pearl Harbor and this, for those of you who might know, Japan was actually allied with Nazi Germany. So when they bomb Pearl Harbor, it brings America into the World War II, and then Nazi Germany declares war on America, and it becomes this global war. And because Japan is allied with Nazi Germany and have now occupied this city with a substantial Jewish community of tens of thousands, Nazi Germany puts a lot of pressure on their ally to do something about the Jews under their control. In fact, they send a few Nazi officers to Japan to make suggestions, like to put the Jews on a boat and sink the boat, killing all of them, to even maybe send the Jews back to Europe, and the Nazis will handle it. The Japanese government does neither of those things. And instead, they sort of relent and establish a ghetto. And this ghetto, this designated area, is for stateless refugees, which includes about 20,000 refugees who had fled Nazi violence from Germany, Austria, Poland, modern-day Lithuania. And then for the Jews who had been established in Shanghai before the refugees, any of them who have any sort of relationship with British, whether they've worked or with the British, whether they're holders of British citizenship or British passports, also any American papers, they're put in Japanese prison camps. So the Sassoon family and the Kadori family are arrested and put in Japanese prison camps, and as well as other Jews who might have any sort of connection with them. For the Jews put in the ghetto, life is very intense and awful. People are forced to live on top of each other in already a very poor neighborhood of Shanghai. They're crammed into small apartments. There's no running water. There's just one communal kitchen. They're living in unsanitary conditions, and movement in and out of the ghetto was restricted, and refugees were required to apply for a pass to leave. And of course, if they didn't have that pass, it would be very obvious if they left the ghetto and were caught without it. And the Japanese authorities in charge were the ones who handed out the passes. They were known for cruelty and violence and humiliation. And luckily for John, he had a job at a Japanese company that continued after the Japanese occupation. For most of the Jews in the ghetto, they lost their livelihood, they lost their jobs, whether it was cafes that they had opened themselves, or working for companies that they were now fired from. So John was one of the few able to obtain an exit pass.
Yeah, it's interesting too. He talks about in his testimony, I guess at some point somebody said to him, tell people you're a mechanic. So he did it, he obviously was a man who knew how to fix things, but he wasn't necessarily trained as being a mechanic in the beginning. But when he arrived in Shanghai, he was a mechanic. So he got a job, at various different places, and then ultimately ends up as an employee of Datsun. And, as an employee of a Japanese run company, he's able to, like Jordana said, secure a pass in and out of the ghetto. He was, in some ways, that made him fortunate. It was a really difficult process to be able to secure a pass. The ghetto was guarded by Japanese authorities. There was 2 particular Japanese authority figures in general who were in charge of the pass system that were known for their brutality and their cruel treatment of the refugees, and many who had jobs outside the ghetto were basically forced or encouraged to quit their jobs, so that they wouldn't have to kind of go through the process of being able to apply for a permit to leave the ghetto every day.
And who is this a photo of that we're looking at?
So this is John on the left, with 2 of his friends at this time. You put me on the spot. I totally can't remember the names of the other 2 people. I'm sorry, Joyce. I know you've told me, but there's definitely one of the other men in the picture. The name is just escaping me right at this second. But yeah, that's John on the left, in his, I guess, mechanic gear.
So the war ends. That's the American soldiers liberate the ghetto in 1945, not in 1941. So excuse us. But so the war ends in 1945. The American soldiers liberate the ghetto, and refugees faced that same daunting process all over again. For many, they had viewed Shanghai as a pass-by, as a place just to escape from, and any businesses that they'd even established when they arrived were totally taken away from them under the Japanese occupation. So they lost everything. And really just this idea of where to go next. News was pouring in from Europe that their family members were murdered, their homes destroyed, their communities completely razed. And going back to Europe didn't seem like a feasible option with everything that had just been destroyed and taken, and anyone that they knew killed. So what's next? Where to go? Well, remember those quotas I was talking about? They still exist. There are still quotas between 1945 and 1948. The Americans are still not letting people into the US unless they have the correct paperwork and sponsorship. The British are not letting people into the British Mandated Palestine, and people are faced with the fact that they simply don't have places to go. So they begin collecting the paperwork all over again. Paperwork saying that they're bona fide refugees, paperwork saying that they actually have professions, paperwork saying that they're educated, paperwork that says who they are and what their experiences were, paperwork just establishing them as people so that they can apply to these different governments and say, like, we just want a place to call home. Here is a passport. This passport's reissued to John because remember, all of those passports from Jews under Nazi control have J's in them, not valid anymore. They need to get new passports. An Austrian embassy is set up specifically to help give new passports to all of the Austrian Jews who had fled, who simply need passports that don't have a red J in them. So like other refugees, John was faced with this daunting task of applying for a visa to emigrate. And, this was really a difficult process. He's able to eventually secure passage to Canada, where he finds work in Toronto and meets his wife, Alice. The couple are married in 1950, and they eventually settle in LA, where their daughter, Joyce, is born. And I think, Christy, you have some artifacts to show us.
Yeah, so the passport that was just showing on the screen is John's passport. Like Jordana said, their passports had to be reissued after the war and after liberation because they were no longer valid. They had the J stamp in them and the Nazi stamp in them. So they had to be issued with new passports. So John's passport is on display in the gallery downstairs, but we do also have Rudolphina's, which was his mother, who was also in Shanghai with him. So you can see this is her passport.
Her new passport, sort of like a reclaiming of identity, like getting a new legal paper that doesn't mark who you are.
And then you can also see, as Jordana mentioned, they had to set up, there was an Austrian consulate in Shanghai. So you can see here, just make sure I'm showing the right page here, is the stamp that was issued at that time. So for Rudolphina. And then, John is trying to find a way to immigrate. So the refugees are faced with this, really monumental task of having to put their lives back together. But as Jordana said, also showing that, they are who they are and that they have qualifications and so there was just this incredible amount of documentation. And we see this with not just John, but with all of the families that we feature in the exhibit is, we have an entire display just dedicated to the documentation and, the hoops that you had to jump through in order to be able to immigrate away from Shanghai. Because, for the refugees that came, they didn't necessarily see this as the place that they were going to settle for the rest of their lives. It was just a way or a means of being able to escape the situation that they were in. So we have some of those documents for John. So this one is from 1949 and basically certifies that he has a clean bill of health. And also he's medically fit. That's his photo there on the back. And, we can see other documentation that basically, confirms that he is a mechanic, he's a professional, he has qualifications, he's an upstanding member of society that should be allowed to basically have a visa to immigrate. This one, interestingly, and Jordana touched on this a little bit before, relates to, obviously, he was trying to get a visa to go to the US, and they had a quota system. So this letter actually is relating to, the fact that he's been added to that quota system and requesting him to come to the consulate office for an interview for that. And then ultimately, he's able to get to Toronto. He's able to immigrate to Toronto, where he meets his wife, Alice, who is also a Holocaust survivor, who survived a number of camps during the Holocaust. And this is a picture of them on their wedding day.
And then even for families, so like the Medavoy family who might have wanted to remain in Shanghai, any family that did, that becomes clearly unable to really happen because of the Chinese Revolution and the Communist Revolution in China. So even families who had maybe seen a future for themselves in Shanghai quickly learn that there is no future for them there. And so the Medavoy family, like many others, look to immigrate to the US. Like many others, are not able to immigrate to the US because of these strict immigration quotas that remain. And so ultimately the family is able to secure passage to Chile, and they set sail in 1947 with their 2 children. And here's some photographs from the ship. They live in Chile for 10 years and eventually are able to make it to the US in 1957. So for whether it be the refugee families learning that their loved ones have been killed in Europe and their communities destroyed, or the Baghdadi Jews coming back from the Japanese prison camps where some of them died, and learning of the upcoming, the spread of communism, or the Jewish families that looked for a future in Shanghai. It just simply does not become an opportunity for them. And so the Sassoons, as a family, end up in the UK, the Bahamas, and some in the US. The Kadoris settle in Hong Kong, and the Medavoys, as I say, make it to Chile. And Christy, do you have any other paperwork or documents to show us?
I have some photos. So we mentioned before that the Medavoys had 2 children. So Mike, who's born in 1941, this is him with Dora. And then Veronica, or Ronnie, who is born in, 1945, I want to say. I'm pretty sure it was very close to the end of the war. And this is a picture of her in the middle, and Dora and their nanny at the time. And interestingly, they did want to immigrate to the US, like many of the refugees that we've been discussing. The US was obviously a very desirable place to settle, but with the strict immigration quotas, it was very difficult to get a visa. Interestingly, I believe they boarded the ship to Chile, and then their visa was actually approved to go to the US. So there was some discussion about turning around during the trip and going back, but ultimately they end up in Chile and settle there for about 10 years. And then they end up eventually immigrating to the US after that.
And I want to say that you might have aged Ronnie a year, because judging from these photos, she was probably born in 46.
Okay. No, wait.
I'm just guessing.
Okay, yeah.
I'm guessing by these photos, I'm trying to age this adorable baby, that she was probably about a year old, perhaps.
Yeah, I 47. I was so close. And the other thing I wanted to show actually as well. So we have one of these on display in the gallery, but the Medavoy family, well, Dora's mother packed a trunk of all of their belongings to go with them on the ship. And actually this incredible tallit and tallit bag was one of the items that came with them on the ship to Chile. So
I love this. Do you have the tallit bag there? So this is, I think, just such an excellent representation of cultures merging. Here you have this incredible Chinese silk and flower design. The one that's on the floor actually has plum blossoms, which is a symbol in China for resiliency. And then the Star of David, the shield of David, the Jewish star. And again, just like speaking to the incredible fusion of cultures taking place in China before it was disrupted by World War II.
So then there's just one last clip that I wanted to include. This is an excerpt from John's testimony, again, from the Shoah Foundation. And right at the end of the interview, he brings his wife Alice in. They're just like the sweetest couple. To hear everything we've just heard about John's incredible story, but also his wife Alice, who also has her own incredible story and has her own Shoah testimony, if anybody is interested in looking that up. But to hear everything that they had been through in their respective lives, to see just this beautiful and really genuine connection that the two of them have for each other is, I thought, just like really inspiring and lovely.
And I think it really speaks to the resiliency of these survivors like John and Mike's family, as well as all of the survivors in our community who've donated artifacts or oral testimony, really understanding that people can go through such dehumanizing, crippling, violent, unimaginable experiences and still be kind, caring, compassionate humans. And that speaks to the resiliency of the spirit. So we'll end on this note before we go to Q&A.
Is there anything that you would like to tell him that you never said
Tell me
before?
something.
Well, he was
Get out of here.
always honest. He was always working hard to make a living for the family. He was always very hard working, and he achieved a lot in his life. He is a loving husband.
Thank you. You got that?
Yes, what do you want to say to her?
What I want to say to her, I have no words. There are no words to what I can say to her. Because if we wouldn't be together for 45 years, what words can mend it?
And the big thing...
And I always love her, that's for sure.
The big thing that we have a family. We were waiting for our daughter for 7 years. And you can imagine our happiness that we finally had a family. And we still have, only she's so far away right now, but maybe someday we will sell the house and move wherever she is.
Yeah, as long as we are young.
And of course now you have the happiness of her marriage.
Yeah.
That's right.
So
This
congratulations to you, Mazel Tov,
is,
and thank you both for letting us come to your house. And
thank you very, very much. It was a pleasure.
thank you.
And I think really speaking to the resiliency of spirit and love, that people can continue despite atrocities. So thank you everyone for joining us for this last 56 minutes. If you're interested in learning more about the hidden histories, recounting the Shanghai Jewish story, we invite you to come to the museum and see the exhibition. You'll be able to identify a few of the objects that we talked about, but see 104 artifacts and 5 stories and 2 testimonies and a series of photographs by an American photojournalist, Arthur Rothstein, you'll be able to see all of that. And it really comes together to tell this unique, pivotal story of a community of Jews in Shanghai, China. So come visit us at the museum. The exhibit will be up through the end of August. And now we have a few minutes for questions. So if you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A. And yes, so a question about Jews remaining in Shanghai after the end of World War II. So there were some Jews who did remain in Shanghai, although the majority of them, faced with the Chinese Revolution, understood that they should leave or that they had better chances leaving. As I mentioned, some did actually go to Hong Kong, and which was British controlled at the time. And so for those who wanted to remain in China, for example, the Kadoorie family, Ali Kadoorie, the patriarch of the family, died in a Japanese prison camp, and his sons came back from the Japanese prison camp, decided to move to Hong Kong, and in fact opened the Peninsula Hotel, which some of you might have heard of. And as the Jewish community in Shanghai is looking to where can we go, some actually go to Hong Kong as refugees still, and the Kadoorie family allows them to stay in the hotel until they can secure papers. But for the most part, very few Jews remain in Shanghai. And as I said, the Jewish community really moves to Hong Kong. What languages did they speak to each other? Great question, Nancy. So, we didn't go too much into the daily life of Jews in Shanghai, but of course, they spoke their mother tongues. So whether it be German or Polish or Yiddish, there were also, I believe we're talking about the refugees, and then we can talk about the Jewish community that was already established. But they did work together, and they did find, so for any of you who are familiar with the different Jewish cultures of Europe, there can be culture clashes between German Jews and Polish Jews. And so they were able to find in the Shanghai ghetto a way to work together. And they even put on Yiddish theater, they put on musical concerts, playing music with each other. The only complete yeshiva to survive the Holocaust, the Mir Yeshiva, which was able to get to Shanghai via Japan, via Sempo Sekihara from Eastern Europe, they continued studying in the Shanghai ghetto. And so there were schools that were set up for the Jewish refugees, most notably by the Kadoorie family, Sir Horace Kadoorie. And this school taught the kids English. They also taught them Chinese. And then after the Japanese occupation, the school continued to operate, but now the kids were taught Japanese. And in addition to math and Tanakh, Bible studies, Torah, etc. So there was a flurry of different languages being spoken. And before the Japanese occupation, there was even a flurry of different newspapers printed in English, German, Polish, Yiddish, etc. So all of the languages that they were speaking already. Then for the Jewish community that was already established, Russian was a primary language, Yiddish, and actually Arabic, as well as Judeo-Arabic. Were languages that were spoken by the Jewish community, and Chinese and English. English being this international language because many of the people established already in Shanghai were working as merchants or as in trade. So English and Chinese being two very important languages for them as well. Great question. So I know that we are coming to the close of the hour. I want to thank everyone for being excellent members and listening to this incredible story. We were only able to touch just the tip of it, the tip of the iceberg. So we really invite you to come to the museum. And I will highlight that we have some upcoming programs related to the Shanghai story. So if you're interested in learning more, on June 9th at 11 Pacific time, we will have Michael Blumenthal, who was the Secretary of Treasury under Carter. Sorry, it slipped my mind for a second. He was the Secretary of Treasury under Carter. And in fact, he was originally born in Germany and fled with his family from the Nazis, from Nazi Germany, settling in Shanghai, and was in the Shanghai ghetto. He is nearing 100, and he will be zooming and sharing his story, both his childhood, his life under the Nazis, as well as his flight to Shanghai, finding refuge in Shanghai as a refugee. Perhaps he'll tell us a little bit about the Carter administration, but also his work championing Holocaust memory. And then in July, we'll have a Lawrence Tribe, who is a law professor at Harvard Law University. His students include Obama, Ted Cruz, and a bunch of other politicians whose names are definitely familiar to you. But Lawrence Tribe was born in Shanghai. His father was good friends with Mike Medavoy's father, or Mike Medavoy, who we talk about in this program. So it's another chance to hear a firsthand experience, a firsthand account, or two opportunities to hear firsthand accounts. And we ask you to follow us on social media, follow us on our YouTube page, and sign up to receive our weekly e-blast where you can learn more about programs like today's and the others. Tune in again to learn more about Holocaust history and its social relevance, and really thinking about how we can join together to create a more dignified and humane world.